It all began the night we returned from my friend's burial. My wife and I were exhausted from the long drive, and neither of us spoke much on the way back. We had just lost a dear friend, and the silence felt appropriate. The weight of grief hung over us like a fog. Around midnight, as I lay in bed, something strange happened. My wife's phone rang, and at the exact same moment, mine did too. Half asleep, I reached over and silenced both phones. It didn't seem unusual. After all, it could have just been a wrong number or a call from someone who didn't realize the hour. My mind was too tired to process much. I rolled over and tried to sleep. The next morning, as the sunlight broke through the curtains, I decided to check the call log. Nothing. No missed calls, no number, just blank. I shrugged it off. But when my wife checked hers, it was the same. No record of a call. We both laughed at how tired we must have been. Maybe we had imagined it. But something about it lingered in my mind. The next night, at exactly midnight, it happened again. Both phones rang at the same time. We both sat up, this time more alert, more awake. But when we looked at the screen, there was no number. It was just blank. I reached out to answer, but my wife stopped me. "Leave it," she said quietly. "Let's check it in the morning." I nodded and silenced the phones again, but a creeping unease had begun to settle in my chest. It didn't make sense. The morning came, and once again, there was no record of the call. We both stared at the phones, confused. "Maybe it's the network," my wife said, trying to reason with herself. "It's probably just some weird glitch." We went about our day, and for the rest of it, nothing unusual happened. There were no calls, no strange occurrences. But deep inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It felt like something had shifted. The third night came, and as if in response to my unease, it happened again. The clock struck midnight, and once again, both phones rang simultaneously. I sat up slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. This wasn't normal, but that wasn't all. When I looked down at the floor, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Tiny ants, dozens of them, crawling across the bedroom floor. I bent down to sweep them away, but then I noticed something else. The bedroom door. It was slightly open. We never left it that way. We always made sure the door was fully closed before going to bed. I stood up, my pulse quickening. Something was off. Something wasn't right. I turned to my wife. "We need to talk to someone about this. This isn't just a coincidence." My wife looked at me, her eyes wide with concern. "Do you think it's the house? The phone calls? The ants? The door?" "I don't know," I said, my voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "But we need answers." I called my friend, the one who had just buried his wife. We had been friends for years, and I trusted him. But when I told him what was happening, he seemed distant. "Bro," I said, trying to explain. "Something strange is happening since that night. Every night at midnight, both our phones ring, but there's no number, no record, nothing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could feel him processing the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but with a hint of tension. "Relax," he said slowly. "Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe it's the network. Just turn your phones off at night." His suggestion sounded reasonable, but something about it felt off. I didn't feel relieved by his words. In fact, I felt even more uneasy. That night, we followed his advice. We turned both phones off and stayed awake, watching, waiting. The clock struck midnight, and then both phones started ringing. Even though they were turned off, my heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't possible. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. But my wife stopped me, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't answer it." I couldn't explain it, but something in her voice made me hesitate. She sounded genuinely scared, but I had to know. I pressed the answer button. The moment I did, the lights in the house went out. And just as suddenly, my wife's phone stopped ringing. I pressed the phone to my ear, my heart racing in my chest. There was nothing but silence. And then I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. My pulse spiked, and I held the phone closer, straining to hear. A faint crackling followed the breath, and then a voice. Help. The call ended abruptly, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I checked my phone. No number, nothing. My wife checked hers. No record of the call, nothing at all. She stared at me, her face pale. "What did you hear?" she whispered. I hesitated before answering. I heard breathing, and then the word help. My wife's face turned even paler. "Did you recognize the voice?" she asked. I shook my head. No, I didn't. A cold breeze suddenly swept through the room, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the window was closed. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. "Something isn't right," I whispered. My wife gripped my arm tightly, her voice trembling. "Please, fix the lights. I need to see." I nodded, trying to stay calm. I stood up and walked toward the fuse box, my mind racing. My hands fumbled with the switch, and after what felt like an eternity, the lights flickered back on. But even with the lights back on, everything felt wrong. The air was thick with unease, and a chill settled in the room. We didn't speak. We just sat in silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my friend standing there, his expression serious. "Did the call come again?" he asked, his voice low. My wife nodded. "It did." I stepped aside to let him in, but as he walked past me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about him. He seemed off. He looked at us both, his eyes searching us. "I'll stay tonight," he said quietly. "I want to hear it myself." I wanted to refuse, to tell him that this wasn't something he needed to get involved with, but I couldn't find the words. "Are you sure?" I asked. "You just buried your wife. You shouldn't be here." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here," he said softly. "We'll figure it out." I nodded, though something about his calmness made my skin crawl. As the day turned to night, my wife and I tried to settle into some semblance of normalcy, but it was hard. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath. And then, my friend returned. He entered carrying a small black bag, his movements deliberate. "I brought something," he said, his voice calm. "Something to help." I wasn't sure what he meant, but I didn't question him. He sat in the living room, placing the bag beside him, and we all waited. For what? I wasn't sure, but I had a feeling that whatever it was about to change everything. It wasn't until later that my wife pulled me aside in the kitchen. She was nervous, her face full of worry. "I don't trust him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know why, but something feels wrong." I tried to calm her down. "You worry too much. I've known him for years. He's just trying to help." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Something wasn't right. As we returned to the living room, my friend poured wine from the bottle he'd brought. We all took a glass, but my wife hesitated. She didn't drink. "Not tonight," she said softly. But he didn't drink either. He just stared at her, his gaze intense, almost predatory. Minutes passed. I started to feel sleepy. Too sleepy. "I want to sleep," I muttered, my voice heavy with exhaustion. My wife turned to me, confused. "Sleep? It's too early," but I couldn't explain it. I just had to lie down. I sank into the couch, my eyes closing as the room grew darker. And then, everything changed. My wife froze, her eyes wide in terror. I tried to sit up, but before I could move, my friend stood up, his voice cold and menacing. "You think you're smart?" he said. The thunder roared, and the storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed through the windows. And then, I saw her, a woman. She stood outside, soaked by the rain, her hair sticking to her face. She was just standing there, watching. My wife gasped, and my friend's face turned pale. "Selena?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I froze. My mind raced. Who was this woman? What did she want? The room fell silent. The storm outside raged, and all I could think about was the strange, unsettling feeling that had taken hold of me. I had to know the truth. But I was too afraid to ask. The night after the strange call, the atmosphere in our house was different. It felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but I had no idea what it was. My wife and I tried to go about our day, but the strange events of the previous night hung over us like a thick fog. Every little sound, every movement felt like it carried more weight than it should have. After we spoke to my friend, and he suggested turning off our phones at night, we thought maybe that would give us some peace. But that night was worse than ever. We switched off our phones, like he said, trying to ease the tension that had been building. The house was quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt off. We stayed up, watching the clock. As midnight approached, we sat together in silence. I could feel my wife's hand tightening around mine, as if she too was waiting for something we couldn't explain. When the clock finally struck midnight, the phones did not ring. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe we were overreacting after all. Maybe everything would go back to normal. But that wasn't the case. A sudden, loud noise broke the silence. It was a sharp, high-pitched ring. Both of our phones, which were supposed to be off, began to ring at the same time. I turned to my wife in disbelief. I didn't know what was going on. The phones were completely off, yet they were ringing. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I had to answer. There was no way I could just sit here and ignore it again. But my wife stopped me. She held my arm firmly. "Don't answer it," she said, her voice trembling with fear. I looked at her. The fear in her eyes mirrored in my own. For a moment, I thought about listening to her, about turning away from whatever this was, but the need for answers was too strong. I reached for the phone and pressed the button to answer. The moment my finger touched the screen, everything went dark. The lights in the house flickered out, and the phone stopped ringing. A sudden chill swept over the room, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I felt my wife's hand clutch my arm, but I couldn't look at her. I was too focused on the phone. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. I pressed the phone to my ear, expecting to hear something, anything. But for a moment, there was only silence. Then, I heard its slow, heavy breathing, as if someone was standing just inches away from the phone. I held my breath, listening carefully. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. Then, I heard something else crackling, faint but unmistakable. It was the kind of noise you hear when a phone connection is weak. But this wasn't just bad service. It felt like something more. Then, a voice, soft, faint, but clear. "Help!" I froze. The blood drained from my face. I pulled the phone away from my ear, but the voice was still in my head. It was a woman's voice, desperate, filled with something I couldn't quite understand. The call ended abruptly, leaving nothing but the eerie silence of the room. My wife's eyes were wide as she looked at me. "What did you hear?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I was silent for a moment. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I heard breathing. I said slowly. And then, I heard a voice. It said, "Help." Her face paled, and she stepped back, her body trembling. "Did you recognize the voice?" she asked, her words barely audible. I shook my head. No, I didn't. But it sounded like a woman. We sat in the darkness, both of us too afraid to speak, the weight of the night pressing in on us. The house felt different, like it was alive with some unseen force. The air was colder, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up. The silence stretched out, making it feel even worse. Then, something strange happened. A cold breeze slipped through the room. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the windows were closed. My stomach churned, and I turned to my wife, trying to push away the growing panic. "Something isn't right," I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the door, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly. I listened carefully, straining to hear anything. The house was quiet again, too quiet. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. "I don't hear anything," I said, but I felt the unease growing inside me. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. I jumped, startled. My heart was racing. I walked over to the door and opened it cautiously. To my surprise, it was my friend. He looked at me with an odd expression on his face, something between concern and curiosity. "Did the call come again?" he asked, his voice low. My wife nodded slowly. "It did," she said, her voice weak. I stepped aside to let him in. As he entered, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His calm demeanor was unsettling. There was an edge to his voice, something I hadn't noticed before. "I heard the voice," I said. "It was a woman. It sounded like she was in trouble, asking for help." My friend's eyes flickered for a second, then he quickly composed himself. "Did you recognize the voice?" he asked quietly. "No," I replied, but it sounded so real, so desperate. He was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll stay tonight," he said. "I want to hear it for myself." I wasn't sure if that was a good idea. He had just buried his wife. This wasn't the right time for him to get involved in something so strange, so unsettling. But before I could say anything, he spoke again. "There's no need to involve anyone else yet," he said calmly. "We'll figure it out." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we didn't need any more involvement in this madness. But his tone was so convincing, so final, that I couldn't bring myself to say anything. That night he returned. This time, he carried a small black bag. I watched as he set it down on the floor beside him, his movements deliberate. He looked at us, his expression unreadable. "We'll find out what's going on," he said quietly. But my wife pulled me aside into the kitchen, her face full of concern. "I don't trust him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know why, but something about him doesn't feel right." I placed my hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. "You worry too much," I said softly. "I've known him for 5 years. He's just trying to help." But even as I said it, a knot twisted in my stomach. Something about his behavior had changed, and I couldn't ignore it. We returned to the living room. My friend opened the black bag and brought out a bottle of wine. He poured it slowly, the rich red liquid filling the glasses. I accepted mine, trying to calm my nerves with a sip. But my wife didn't take hers. She simply watched him, her eyes filled with suspicion. "You're not drinking?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. She shook her head, her eyes never leaving him. "I'm fine," she replied. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that I look back, I realize how strange that moment was. His eyes lingered on her for just a second too long, and that unease in my chest grew stronger. Minutes passed in silence. I felt myself growing sleepy, the exhaustion from the previous nights catching up with me. "I want to sleep," I muttered, unable to fight it anymore. "Sleep? It's too early," my wife said, sounding confused. But I didn't answer her. My eyes were heavy, and I couldn't stay awake any longer. I sank down onto the couch, my mind foggy. But as soon as I lay down, something strange happened. My wife froze, her eyes wide with alarm. She turned to me, her mouth open to say something, but before she could move, my friend stood up. His voice was low, almost dangerous. "You think you're smart?" he said, his words dripping with venom. The thunder roared, and the rain began to pour heavily. Lightning flashed across the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then we saw her. A woman. She was standing outside in the rain, her white gown soaked through. Her hair clung to her face, and she didn't move. She just stood there, staring. My wife gasped, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I turned to my friend, but his face had gone pale. His lips trembled as he whispered the name. Selena? Who was this woman? Why did he recognize her? And why was she standing there, watching us? I had to know. But something told me that the truth might be more terrifying than I could imagine. The woman stood outside, her figure ghostly in the storm. The rain poured down, soaking her white gown, her dark hair plastered against her face. She didn't move an inch. She just stood there, watching us. My wife gasped and backed away slowly, her hand gripping mine tightly. My heart raced, my pulse quickened. I couldn't understand what was happening. I turned to my friend, desperate for answers, but his face had gone pale. His eyes widened in disbelief, and I could hear his voice tremble as he whispered, "Selena?" I didn't know who Selena was, but from the look on my friend's face, I knew she was someone important to him, maybe someone from his past, someone he had loved or lost, but I couldn't be sure. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain and the distant thunder. We just stood there, frozen. The woman outside didn't speak. She didn't move. She only watched us, her presence chilling us to the bone. I finally found my voice. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My friend swallowed hard, his throat dry. He took a few steps toward the window, his gaze never leaving the woman outside. "Selena," he began, his voice breaking. "She was my wife. She died years ago." I froze. His wife? The woman standing outside was his wife? "Wait, what are you talking about?" I asked, struggling to make sense of what he was saying. "Your wife, but she's dead?" My friend nodded slowly, his face contorted with grief. "She died in a car accident," he said quietly. "It was years ago, but I've never forgotten her. And now she's here. She's come back." My mind spun. I couldn't understand it. This couldn't be happening. A dead woman couldn't just appear outside our window soaking wet, staring at us. It didn't make sense. "I don't get it," I said, shaking my head. "How is this even possible?" But my friend didn't answer me. Instead, he walked toward the door. "I need to go out there," he said. "I need to talk to her." "No," I called out, rushing to stop him. "You can't go out there. She's not real. It's not possible." But my friend didn't listen. He opened the door slowly, stepping outside into the rain. My wife and I stood frozen, watching from the window. He took slow, cautious steps toward the woman. The rain drenched him, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on her, and it was as if nothing else mattered. "Selena," he said softly, almost pleading. "Is it really you? Are you really back?" The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at him with those empty, haunting eyes. I watched in silence, my chest tight with fear. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. And then, something happened. The woman took a step forward. Slowly, carefully, she reached out her hand. My friend hesitated, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Selena, is it really you?" he asked again, his voice trembling. But before he could touch her, the woman suddenly collapsed, falling to her knees in front of him. My friend rushed to her side, panic in his eyes. "Selena, what's happening?" he shouted. But it was too late. The woman's body was limp in his arms. The rain continued to pour down, but there was no movement from her. I ran outside, grabbing my wife's hand as I rushed to join my friend. We reached him, but as we looked at the woman in his arms, we realized something terrifying. Her face was pale, her body cold. She wasn't breathing. I turned to my friend, horror spreading across my face. She's gone, I whispered, my voice breaking. He shook his head violently. No, she can't be gone. She was here. She was alive. His voice cracked, and he began to sob, his body shaking with grief. My wife stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. What is happening? She whispered. What is this? I don't know, I said softly, my voice filled with confusion and dread. But this isn't real. This can't be happening. As we stood there in the pouring rain, something strange happened. The woman's body began to disappear, slowly, almost like smoke. Her figure faded away until there was nothing left but the rain-soaked ground. My friend looked around frantically, his eyes wide with panic. No, 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 he screamed, but there was nothing to be seen. The woman, Selena, had vanished. We stood there in silence for a long time, the rain still falling heavily around us. My friend collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. I reached out to him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. What could I say? There were no words to explain what had just happened. After a long while, we all made our way back inside. My wife and I tried to comfort him, but he wasn't really there. His mind was somewhere else, lost in the past, and I couldn't blame him. I couldn't imagine what it felt like to see someone you loved, someone who was supposed to be gone, appear before you like a ghost. We sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us. What had just happened? What had we witnessed? And what was that voice we had heard on the phone? Was it really Selena? In the days that followed, we never spoke of that night again. My friend stopped coming around. He disappeared into himself, retreating into his grief. My wife and I tried to move on, but there was a lingering sense of unease, of something unfinished, something we couldn't explain. The calls stopped after that. We never heard from Selena again, but every time the clock struck midnight, I felt a chill run through me, as if something was watching us, something we couldn't see. Moral lessons. 1. Grief can be powerful and consuming. The pain of losing someone can create emotional ties so strong that they almost feel like they can bring the person back, even if just in our minds. Sometimes, our grief manifests in ways we don't fully understand or expect. 2. Not everything is as it seems. Just because something feels real or terrifying doesn't mean it is. Our minds can play tricks on us, especially in moments of stress, fear, and confusion. What we see or hear may not always be what's truly happening. 3. The past can haunt us if we let it. Sometimes, unresolved emotions or past experiences can come back to haunt us in unexpected ways. If we don't deal with our grief or pain, it can continue to affect us long after the event has passed. 4. Acceptance is necessary for healing. Moving on from loss is never easy, but it's something we must do to heal. Sometimes, we have to accept that the past is gone and that there's nothing we can do to change it. But by accepting it, we allow ourselves to find peace and move forward. The events of that night stayed with me, but I learned that sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of the things we cannot control, no matter how frightening or confusing they may be. And in the end, we can only find peace by accepting what has happened and learning to live with it.